All right, it looks like we're live. All right. Welcome everybody and welcome to Live at 9. So this is just sort of an impromptu sort of thing that we're kind of trying out. I have never done a live on my own before. And just as a heads up, I'm Justice Graves. Welcome to my channel. And this is where we talk about different things with regards to a little bit of everything to do with municipal government. And boy, oh boy, have there been some gems that I've been sitting on for quite a while that we really need to discuss. But we're going to get into that. I'm going to kind of wait a minute to see if there are any live viewers. Try and comment something because I've never done this before. And I'm not using YouTube to stream, so this is very interesting. I've done a lot of things. This isn't one of them. Shouldn't say it like that. There is a delay with this stuff. So if you did chat something in, I have no idea if I've gotten it yet. I'm going to take a big assumption in like 2 seconds that nobody's in, which is fine. This is a little bit easier than if I were to prep and do stuff anyway. It's probably good to just sort of get my stream of consciousness up onto, my regular channel so that way we can see what's going on. So what this particular stream is about is what's going on in New Hampshire. I've been very quiet about certain things to do with the different funding sources that are going on with the COVID relief packages or the COVID relief packages that have sort of gone through. For those of you who don't know, my regular day-to-day job is working in municipal government. And one of the things that I get to see a lot of up close and personal is what goes on the municipal side of things with the ARPA money. Now, in a past life, and by past life, I mean basically less than 9 months ago, I was a school committee member before I got this job. I got elected, and that's how we started this whole, trip onto YouTube, onto the universe of YouTube, which, sometimes you regret and sometimes you can enjoy it. But that's another story for another time. What I'm trying to get at is that I've also seen it from the other side where you're voting as a committee member and you have to make a decision on important funding and where that funding can go and what the state guidelines are telling you based off of the federal guidelines. And what I mean is that the state guidelines are often based off of the federal guidelines. And there's a lot of people who are in those positions of committees who don't understand what they're doing, and a lot of boards and stuff. Right now, there are a lot of discussions in a lot of municipalities because when we're talking about the American Rescue Plan Act, which is considered one of the COVID relief packages right behind the CARES Act and the CRSSA Act, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 is one of the most interesting because it's one of the largest in America's history. And it has a huge source of funding for education specifically, and it dumps a ton of money, the most money out of all 3 packages that we've seen in the past 2 years, into what's called the Education Stabilization Fund. So what is the ESF? You've probably heard about it a little bit, especially if you've been watching The Reason We Learn, which is Deb's channel, which I've been on a few times. The ESF is basically this giant pot of money that the state gives. Well, not that the state gives, the state does deal that money out, but that the federal government gives to each state. Now, in the ESF, it's broken out. I don't want to get too much into it on this particular stream, but I just want you to understand that there's categories in there. There's what's called ESSER. ESSER is the emergency money for elementary school relief, or, elementary and, regular education relief. So you see that go to the high schools, you see that go to the middle schools, you see that go to, your pre-K programs, you see that go to your after-school programs. That's what that fund's for. You also see it going to colleges, and the requirements for what they can do are significantly different at the college level. That fund is called the HEER. That's the Higher Education Emergency Fund, or Emergency Relief Fund. Then you have the money that's for government. So this, the federal government also allotted a certain percentage that allows the federal government and the state governments to have the funds, to have the people to disperse the money or to properly log and audit the money as well. So that's where that fund is. It's called GEER. And then private schools, a lot of people don't know this, and we'll go over it in a later video that I'm going to do probably in a few days or probably a week from now, because I've been sort of swamped with stuff at work lately, that the EAN is emergency relief for non-public schools. I can't remember exactly why it's called the EAN. I believe it has to do, the N stands for non-public. I can't remember what the other two are. The E stands for emergency. I don't remember why the end is there, why the A is there, my bad. Freudian slip. But schools that are non-public also get money as well. That was a big inclusion. I can't remember if it's the CRRSA. I've been researching all of them lately, all three of aid packages, COVID relief packages, but ARPA explicitly has a section that talks about it and that pours a ton of money into it. So I just want to make everybody aware of that before we go through this. Today's title is about that we really need to talk about New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire lately has been talking a lot about how it's the freest state in the nation. Well, that's great, but your legislators and even the people running for office have absolutely no idea what they're legislatively looking at. They have no idea what they're doing in terms of policy-making decisions, and they have no idea how this actually looks in terms of municipal government and state government when it comes to the threat of social emotional learning and critical race theory, which is a big topic on this channel. It's a big topic of basically 2020 and 2021 if you were living through it and weren't hiding in a box. But if you're just catching up, don't feel bad. It's not the easiest topic to sort of go through. And if you like this stream so far, feel free to like and subscribe to my channel. I do other stuff like this. And just remember, this is my first time doing a live on my own, so bear with me here. I'm doing a long intro. I don't plan on being on for very long to sort of do this, because I think this is going to be pretty self-explanatory how bad this is. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm going to have to spend some time to sort of guide you through why it's so bad. If you haven't watched my other videos, I've done this sort of on Arizona. So I've already done this sort of breakdown with the Arizona State Educational Plan. It's basically the plan for those extra monies that they're spending. But what's going on is New Hampshire, I thought, based on, I'm actually going to show you this document. Let me pull this up. Add it to screen. Here we go. So every single state had to basically state their highlights, what they're proud of that's in the plan for how to spend this ARPA money, the American Rescue Plan money. And you'll notice there's a bunch of highlights in here. I'm going to kind of go over why, this sort of got my attention. At first glance, New Hampshire's was actually looked pretty benign. I didn't think, because I had done a long Twitter thread a couple months ago about this, I did not think that New Hampshire was a problem. Now, I looked through, and I knew a little bit about Section 2001 on ARPA. I knew that there was a social emotional learning section. I said, okay, so every state's going to have language that's kind of similar, but what states are doing it and what states aren't? And then Deb did a stream with Sloan R. I can't say her last name, but God bless her. She does great work in the state of North Carolina, and they are going after Catherine Truitt hard. I'm just going to say congratulations, ladies down there. You are leading the fight against probably one of the most shady superintendents of public instruction that North Carolina has ever seen, and that apparently has powers and then doesn't have powers. Oop. How is this going? Did we freeze up? Nope, we're going good. All right. Again, have not done one of these on my own. So at first glance, it looks fine. You're not seeing references to Panorama. Panorama is one of the really bad social emotional learning programs. And if you've never heard of social emotional learning is basically it's like unscrewing your child's head and walking around in it and messing with everything going on in there. That is what social emotional learning is. You can also, if we're talking about computers, it's basically like changing up the entire hard drive. And then if you're putting in stuff like critical race theory, or if you're putting other stuff in like critical social justice in general, well, those things are kind of like software that meshes perfectly with that hardware. Normal people sort of react very bad to CRT, and we've sort of seen this for the past 2 years, but when you program them right, or when you hardwire them right, I should say, that's when you have that inroad to sort of basically have little minions, which is what we've been seeing, at large in a lot of these different school districts that have been exposed on the internet through varying means. But if you're looking at it, you think, okay, like, that ARPA talks about social emotional learning and mental health. So of course you're going to see it here. And then you see this through some type of contract. And I said, okay, it has to do with camps and stuff. But you're kind of like, okay, interesting. And then, you think nothing of it. And it's like, okay, let's look at, we're going to go down and I'm going to switch over to my other document because we have several. And then you're like, okay, let's look at what New Hampshire's actually doing then. Because I'm sure everything, everything is fine. And then you go to, I got to find it. There we go. And then you have to go on to, you find this and you're like, okay, let's actually look at the plan. This might be a good example of what you're not supposed to do. This might be a good example of how to use the money without it being woke. And then you kind of go through this and, dated on June 7th. Now, there's an important reason why I'm bringing up why this was, the date that it was submitted to the Department of, to the Federal Department of Education. This is Frank Edelblatt, I believe is how I said his name. I probably actually said it wrong. He's the Commissioner of Education. Some states have like superintendents of public instruction. Some states have other things. Well, a lot of the New England states have, the governor appoints a commissioner, and Frank Edelblatt is the Commissioner of Education for New Hampshire. And this was submitted to the Department of Ed on June 7th, 2021. Now, I want to put sort of into context here. A few months before that, I was jumping up and down with a few people talking in New Hampshire about what was going on with one of the new regulations that the Federal Department of Education wanted to do with critical race theory in American historical grants, American history grants, rather. And that went interestingly. And then, if you actually go further back than that, there was a group in New Hampshire trying to push a bill called House Bill number 544. I was a big proponent of that bill, supporting it from where I was sort of in Massachusetts. And as it sort of went forward, there were multiple conversations with high-level people who knew what was going on with this, who talked with the Republican legislature about it, because the Democrats weren't going to do anything. The Committee on Education and the House Committee on Education basically slammed the thing as being a racist bill, when it literally said that the point of this was to tell people that they, you couldn't essentially train people to be racist. That was illegal. But, nobody actually read the bill. They just heard that it had something to do, people don't understand what critical race theory is on the left, or they do, and they play by two different rule books. And then we get this situation, or the situation that played out. That whole conversation happened in March and April, what was going on with House Bill number 544, there's a lot of negotiations that went on with that bill, and it ended up getting gutted significantly and being put into the budget for the next fiscal year. And that didn't really go well. Although it's hilarious how many people didn't read it and understand what had actually happened. At the same time, just because you put something into legislation does not mean that is the end of it, because everyone from the state legislature to the executive to the judicial needs to understand what they're looking at. And I don't think a lot of people understand when it comes to this whole critical social justice nonsense going on and the utter mental manipulation that is going on in our public education system. They don't know what to look for in some of these contracts and in some of these documents. And they're being really sneaky about it. So that's the context that the Commissioner of Education should have known way before, because of all the stuff going on with HB 544, when he was submitting this, to not do certain things within it. Well, they did all the things that you probably would have expected that New Hampshire did, talking about how they're, not a centralized, State Department of Education, how the different, localities have sort of uniform ability to do what they want. And that sort of reflects in the titles. In Massachusetts, we have school committees. In New Hampshire, they're called school boards or regional school boards. Those school boards are in charge of pretty much everything from an executive standpoint. The administrative standpoint, it goes to the superintendent of that locality. But you read through it, everything in blue on this is actually the questions that the federal government asked. And then the blue, the blue is what the federal government asked, and the black is what New Hampshire responded with officially. And you go through, everything looks fine. I've read through this, everything looks fine. And then you start getting down to the stuff about identifying needs of underserved students. And you start to hit a couple of things. You start to hit that social emotional language, specific interventions, specific to gender, race, ethnic, and family income subgroups. There are requirements for that in federal, in federal statutes that have to do with the Elementary and Secondary Education Acts that passed many, many decades ago. There are requirements to look at this information and to try and use it in an appropriate manner. But then you start getting into the social emotional language will be, social emotional well-being data through the 603 Bright Futures Survey, a new statewide school climate survey. So first we're going to start up here. So what is, this is probably a good point to sort of bring out, what is school climate? School climate is just a fancy way of saying, and I'm going to bring something up when this just doesn't want to behave today. Maybe if I do this, something will let me do it. Nope, it doesn't want to cooperate with me. This is what happens when we go live. See, this is my first time trying to do this, so if you see me floundering on the screen, I don't want to do the whole screen because I'm actually using two screens right now, and you'll get to see both of them. And that's going to be Inception and probably flip everything out. So that's probably not a good idea. But so we'll just kind of go with what it is. Allow that, and then we're going to pull back for a minute. So school climate is basically the intersection of what's actually going on in schools with the perception of what's going on in schools. And it's a fancy way of saying, how are we, I'm trying not to be super cynical about this, but it's hard not to be, so I am kind of going to be cynical about this. It's basically fancy speak for how do we, we've identified a public, a court of public opinion problem, and it's possibly related to this thing that we're doing that's really bad. But we're not going to tell people that we do it or that we have these bad teachers doing illegal stuff that we can't fire because of unions. We're not going to tell them that. We got to change the public narrative. So let's change that. So basically, school climate is evaluating how do people view you and how do people view what you're doing through your actions as a local educational group, as a local educational authority. Or an LEA, or or a school district, rather, to put it into more layman's terms. That's what's going on when they talk about evaluating school climate. It's the perception of what's going on. So it's about what you think is going on, how you feel based on what you're seeing. It's not about as much as what's actually going on physically. There's some component of that, but there's not a lot of it. And in many cases, they sort of water that down to be, as little as possible. It's all about PR. And if you've never had a child in public school, then maybe, honestly, it's its own universe. So that's sort of what they're talking about. One of the other sort of catches on this is, then you have to look up, what is 603 Bright Future Survey? Well, 603 is I was informed this because I don't live in New Hampshire. I don't know this readily. 603 is the area code for New Hampshire. So I'm like, okay, This is probably, you can probably look this up. Like, what is this thing? This, you know, New Hampshire's got to be smart. If they're not funding social emotional learning, which I'm going to take them that they're not because they probably, hopefully know better than to do this, then, you know, maybe I can look at this survey and maybe it's a decent one. You know, it's not a terrible one. You know, Jason Littlefield does great social emotional learning. Maybe this isn't bad. So then, you can't see it on the screen now. That's, ooh. Let's try and show another screen. Now I'm learning that I don't want to do, no. That is not the screen that we want. Why can't I select this one? Interesting. Well, this is different. Bear with me here, folks. Bear with me here if any of you were actually watching live. Remember this decision. Oh, this is going to be Inception. Oh, this isn't going to work. Nope, not good. Getting that off the screen. Nope, remove. Nope, that was bad. All right. No, I not want to share a video file. Nope, we are not sharing video files. That is not what we want to do. I want to just share a certain screen. There we go. We got it, ladies and gentlemen. All right, it was just labeled weird. All right, so we're going to talk about that in a minute because there's even more stuff than what I realize. So look up the 603 Bright Future survey. It takes you to the Department of Education's website in New Hampshire. Like, okay. So then you click, you know, what could this possibly be and stuff. But before I even clicked on this, and this has been updated since, you know, I clicked on it originally back in the in autumn. Look at here, because we've talked about Panorama, or I've talked about Panorama on this channel, and I've talked with Deb and Sloan about it. That's the Panorama Help Desk for Panorama Ed, the Panorama Ed, the bad one, the one that is the boogeyman of all children in America. New Hampshire the New Hampshire Department of Education partnered with them to collect social emotional learning information statewide in a state whose Department of Education prides itself on not being centralized. So, and that supports local control. So they basically just deployed a tool out to basically get, you know, to help Panorama get a feel for what's going on. And Panorama and only a few other ones like Castle and stuff basically have a duopoly on this entire situation. Between Castle and Panorama, it's a duopoly on this. But notice that in the document, and we'll go back, notice that in the name of the survey, it doesn't say it's a Panorama survey. A lot of the other ones that I've looked at, and Arizona is one of them, they name Castle and Panorama explicitly. They talk about how they're going to work on negotiations with them for contracts. They talk about how they're going to work on distribution. They talk about how they're going to work on data aggregation. I've been over this before on this channel. This is a lot more sneaky in another state that, quite frankly, wouldn't have the appetite for something a lot more forefront. But the Commissioner of Education knew, or at least I hope he actually read the thing and knew and looked at all of this material and knew that they were signing up with a contract for Panorama on this, using federal tax dollars that they were given. So that's sort of what we're dealing with, folks. Now, this has not been reported well, that there was a Panorama survey out there, because it doesn't say Panorama. It's not flashy. It doesn't have a logo on it. So no one's really been talking about it. But if you go further into the not so exciting and not so hopeful document from the state, come on, let's share a new screen. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the easiest way to do things. If you go through, you're going to see quite a bit of stuff. One of the other things, and the only reason I highlighted this is because it has another thing to do with identifying situations of social emotional learning. They use language that I'm very familiar with. There's this language called stakeholder feedback, stakeholder groups. Stakeholder groups are trash. And I want to make that very clear off the bat. Stakeholder groups are trash. They are basically code word for we're going to choose a biased sample of the most active members of our community who want to participate in a discussion with us that represents certain categories. And that's how we're going to base how we're going to move forward on projects and programs. Now, I want to ask you, who are the most active people that a school administration would, select for a private feedback group? Or initially it would be a private feedback group, and then the feedback from the group would go public. It just, their individual comments would not be, it'd be aggregated. They wouldn't have identifiers on them. It would basically be blinded. The people would know who were involved in it, but they wouldn't know who made what specific comments. You're not going to choose the conservatives who are going to school boards clearly concerned that their kids are being taught very illegal stuff, or that they're being taught things that are anti-American. Although being taught anti-American things isn't necessarily a wrong thing, where it crosses the line, because I think you should always be skeptical of what's going on in your government, which is what I'm talking about right now. But my concern with the anti-American stuff goes towards you should feel bad for being American no matter who you are. And that's when it really starts to become a self-esteem problem and a larger problem when we're talking about the mental health of students. And I don't know. But stakeholders basically, so you're not going to grab those people and you're not going to grab the conservatives. What you are going to grab are the parents that you like. You're also going to try and double up on categories. So, and this is common, a lot of people get on school boards locally in New England because they have, because their kids are in school. So, and I saw this firsthand. Chair of the school committee is the chair of the school committee, but she's got a kid. So she's considered a parent. So she fills one of the parent slots too. Then you have an administrator. The administrator's got a kid. So they fill a slot. You got another school committee member who is going to join on, but they're a teacher at another district, but they're a teacher, so they qualify for that category. So they're also an instructor. So they're over in that lane. There's specific, and why I'm mentioning all these sort of subgroups is because stakeholder groups require that you have your local chief executives that are involved. So that's your school boards and committees. You have your local administrators involved. That's your superintendents, your principals, and your different financial administrators who will comment and have weight on things. You'll have parents from writ large at the community. Ideally, you'll have a diverse group of parents, but you can double up in many cases. That's perfectly allowed with having somebody fill two categories, and then you select students. Well, and this I didn't see in this particular instance, but there are some out there where I would be pretty sure if you looked hard enough, you find them, where you have chairs of school committees filling the parent slot and probably the kid on there as well, giving feedback, or someone who is a friend of the child. And I'm pretty sure there were a few cases of that I've actually seen where it's like they were only a few degrees of separation between the parent that was discussing, who happened to be an administrator or somebody else, and then the kid that was talking, who was in favor. Usually the kid is actually selected, is the student representative, because they're a lot more in tune with what's going on in the funding process, because they're brought in because they're supposed to, the student reps. So that's what happens. As you can tell, it's basically confirmation bias to the next level, because you're selecting such a small group of people with such limited thought. It's not diverse of thought. You may be grabbing, I fill all of these hundreds of categories, but if you're so focused on the blocks that you're trying to address, you have no interest in anything else that's going on. You're basically, going with the status quo of, I fit these boxes. I'm not thinking about, and I'm trying to fit stuff into other boxes. I'm not thinking about how do I work these boxes in a different way to create something new, which is depressing when you're sitting in a meeting and you're like, okay, how did the stakeholder meeting go? And then you look at the results and you're like, that's biased. I really am not going to use this. And you're sitting there and it's not fun. But stakeholder groups are trash. They are not useful. It is much more useful to use other forms of collecting information. Now, there could be groups that do stakeholder groups correctly, but I haven't seen it. And not in any of the school board meetings I've watched, not in any of the things I've been involved in. It's not good. So they're talking about how they're going to use this to try and figure out how to spend the money. Well, of course, if you're picking the most involved people who are politically advantageous for the district, you're going to get some crazy stuff about what's going on. Also, if anyone's watching this who knows, I'm going to have to look at this term later. It's called student growth percentiles. Let me put it to you this way. I understand what's going on in terms of the legislative stuff and where to hunt for things to know, like, I hear stakeholder groups and I'm like, this is bad. But student growth percentiles, that is something that I've heard about in education, but it's really in the lane of education when it comes to evaluating stuff. I don't actually know if they're good or not. I don't actually know if they're done properly, if they make sense. If you know that and you're an educator, please reach out because I have no idea what I'm looking at with that. I can't tell if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm going to just basically assume nothing until I get some answers on what that actually sort of represents. I just did not have time to learn a whole new subject before I got into this. There's the whole school climate conversation again. They have an Office of Social and Emotional Wellness. That should be a red flag right there. And then they have this thing called multi-tiered systems of support for behavioral health and wellness. And I thought, okay, this looks like a special program that they probably put on their website. And as you probably saw a few minutes ago, or probably like 10 or 20 minutes ago at the rate I'm going, I'm going to try and speed this up. I am slow when I am not trying to pre-record and script myself. Allow. I'm going to go back to the 6 Free Bright Future survey. If you look at the MTSSB, and as you can see, it's clearly on the Department of Ed's website for New Hampshire, you're going to see that it's about student wellness, community-driven. It's trauma responsive, but it doesn't define what trauma is at all. It's about their voices, the youth voice, okay. And then you see the really bad stuff that we saw also all over Arizona's educational standards. That video wasn't just looking at the ARPA funding. It was also looking at what are they doing and how are they hiding stuff in terms of their professional standards. Now, New Hampshire, you have to be licensed to be a teacher in there, specifically according to very, very stringent state standards that they have over there. It's not necessarily easy. It's an obnoxious process over there. It's a little bit, how do I put this? Massachusetts and New Hampshire have to be licensed. And the licensing is a little bit different between both states, but New Hampshire's a little bit, I find it obnoxious in what I had seen, but maybe some people find Massachusetts' procedures more obnoxious. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine. That's just my comments for at large. But look at equity and cultural competence. That's the values that this program has, or that this framework of this program has. We all know that is code word for critical race theory. So they have a program, and I don't know how long this has been going on for, but it looks like that they're funding through ARPA. And integrated mental health delivery systems, talking about student outcomes. I mean, seriously, they are highlighting core features that are no offense, the dog whistles of critical race theory, SEL-driven, nonsense. And so I'm sitting here trying to, in my mind's eye, I'm trying to defend what New Hampshire is doing, saying, okay, New Hampshire, you must know what you're doing. This must all be a facade. But no, this is, New Hampshire doesn't know what it's talking about. I'm going to go back to, we are not allowing that. Let's ignore that. No, we are going to. go back to the document. You're going to block that. No, that's not going to work. See, this is, you blocked your browser screen. Okay. Block temporarily. Can we screen share again? There we go. We are back in business. All right. I gotta find a better way to do this. I've never gone live before on my own. 6 Free Bright Future survey. They mentioned it twice. School climate pilot. Basically, what they're talking about here and in a couple of the other sections downstream are that they're trying to associate positive experiences with going physically into physically going into school. So just be aware of that. If you actually click on these links, if you actually have the document, which I'm going to relink where you can get this and where you can find all 50 states in the description box when this video actually is done. I'll probably do it tomorrow, but it's bad. They're also, so New Hampshire doesn't have a statewide student information system, but what they do have, it's a little bit late down here. This is I was curious about this. So they put a lot of money from the state's fund this is the Government Educational Emergency Relief Fund for basically summer camp for the kids. If anyone from New Hampshire can tell me if there was any woke stuff going on at the summer camps, that would be very curious, but I kind of doubt it. I'm curious why their Department of Parks and Recreation didn't. Well, I'm curious to see what kind of funding they're putting in for that kind of stuff, because ARPA did release money into them as well for the municipalities and for the statewide stuff. But it's interesting that they're doing that. I find that really strange. I mean, hey, if New Hampshire wants to focus on its parks and stuff when it's basically wide open green spaces, I'm not going to complain about it. But there's also high quality resources. They partnered with the Department of Health and Human Services in the CDC, or they followed the CDC stuff. One of the other things that you need to understand, this is why I highlighted this section, is that it's a little bit of fake news that New Hampshire isn't doing anything with regards to COVID money for testing and doing stuff for COVID. That is whoever was spreading that information, and I know who it was, and they should have known better to actually read some of this stuff on this. And I told them there was a big possibility if they were doing this stuff in this document that they were accepting COVID money for stuff, and they were spending it on COVID testing and all the stuff that the Republicans said that they weren't going to spend it on. I said, listen, doesn't matter what your perspective on this is. They are using it for this stuff for the school districts. And a lot of people said, well, no, the executive council rejected that weird round of funding from the government. Well, not really. In this section for the educational plans, by accepting the money, they had to follow certain parts of Section 2001 in the public schools. The non-public schools didn't necessarily have to. I've looked at that section. It's a little strange. Although anything that comes out of the Education Stabilization Fund, which the EAN is within, again, that's the full fund of all the ARPA money that the state got. It's the big pot of money at the end of the tunnel, at the end of the rainbow, is the ESF, just trying to get that image through your head. That carried with it the requirement that you needed to follow CDC guidance and follow best practices and constantly monitor and update what your plans were going to be. And that's sort of what I've highlighted down there, is that they were doing stuff and distributing stuff out to school districts and implying that they really should follow a lot of the different guidance that was offered. As well as that they were also promoting programs for vaccination and all sorts of other stuff, which I know is controversial. But regardless of your sort of position on that, the governors, not the governors, geez, it's not like that in New Hampshire. The executive council did not block that. The Commissioner on Education let that through. So that's fake news going on up in New Hampshire that was spreading around. I don't remember which publication was doing it, but I know which people on the internet were. And that's not what was happening. And I didn't say it outright. And I probably should have been a little bit more specific when I was talking about that stuff, but I was pretty confident that this was not going well. Or that this was, that there was not as much transparency as people were aware of was going on. There is something in here, the status of schools, basic requirements, blah, blah, blah. Basically, they say here that they're quote unquote not super involved, but they seem to be very involved in what this, the different localities are doing. One of the things is that they have to, and it's a federal requirement, they have to monitor and come up with new plans. And this is sort of the way that their state is doing it, but every state has to reevaluate every so often. Their district opening response plans for the pandemic. And this is required through 2023 going into fiscal year, this is, we've already started fiscal year 24 when we're in this. And it's constant. In New Hampshire, they're doing it every 6 months. I'd have to double check in that section of ARPA, but while they don't have statewide student information, they've partnered with the Department of Health and Human Services to have specific school information for what instructional models are being used throughout the state, whether a school is virtual or whether it's in person. So they partnered up with the Department of Health and Human Services for that for some reason, but yet they weren't collecting information on students, at least having individual like little tabs and files on them at the state level. But then they were collecting all of this information on them for social emotional learning and other stuff, because those surveys have other stuff in them. So, regardless of what you think about the COVID stuff, which was just a flat out lie. Maybe they rejected it. You know what? They may have rejected that one part of funding, but they didn't reject it within this bill and within this proposal that was put forward. It's as if nobody, and you know what? I don't remember who's on the executive council for New Hampshire and how that sort of gets organized. But if the Commissioner of Education's on there, then that's not good. Another thing that I want to point out, because I've been sort of vocal on the internet about this, is that New Hampshire has, just like every other wonderful state, school board associations and associations for administrators and associations for superintendents. Every state has these things. And in fact, we're about to see a gigantic list of them. These are basically the group. Basically, if you get elected, you get to be a member of, as long as your municipality pays dues of the School Boards Association of New Hampshire. In Massachusetts, it's the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, MASC. If you're in Massachusetts and you're a school superintendent, because that's the highest level administrator in the state, before you go to the State Board of Education with the Commissioner of Education, then you have the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents, also known as MASS. This is NSA, NHSA. And then here's the list, and no offense, but I can tell that this was copy and pasted. Stakeholders representing the interests of children with disabilities, blah, 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 blah. They're talking about that they are grabbing representatives for these stakeholder groups from these associations, which are paid for by the state with, state and federal tax dollars that are coming out of the pockets of taxpayers. But here's the thing, like all sorts of things like the National Athletic Directors Association. If you didn't know, New Hampshire had that. New Hampshire School Boards Association, that exists. I already told you there's a PTA association for New Hampshire. There's the National School Principals Association. Massachusetts has this Parent Teachers Association thing too at the state level as well. And actually they get to have a seat on some of them if they get put up and the governor selects them, they get to be a member of the Board of Education. So I would be curious to see who's on the Board of Education for the state of New Hampshire, because I'm pretty sure there's members from some of these organizations on there. The School Administrators Association, the School Principals Association, the School Teachers Association. I'm pretty sure that might be a union, but I think that's actually just an association, a regular association. the National American Federation of Teachers. So that AFT, yeah, that this is a union. And you can see that it's actually copy and pasted because look at the bottom. The New Hampshire Athletic Directors Association and the New Hampshire School Boards Association are duplicated. And I'm actually pretty sure there might be a couple other things that are pretty similar in here that may be duplicates, but I'd have to double check a little bit. But yeah, someone didn't proofread that. Because if I read that and then I looked at that, so I'm pretty sure they just copy and paste this every time, which tells you how much they actually take their job seriously with getting representative stakeholder groups. So just be aware of this. This is common in all of the states. I haven't pointed it out pretty aggressively, but just be aware of that. The money for how much they use on COVID is also within here as well, for all of the different stuff that they've done. One of the things I really want to point out in here, there's a few other things, but I kind of want to wrap this up. Yeah, probably now before we hit 50 minutes is, oh no, nobody can see that, thank God, because it doesn't show up on the screen on Streamyard. I didn't think about that. Let me take my screen off before I start sharing more stuff on here. There we go. Had to stream. Thank God that didn't pop up. It was just a personal message. This is to inform strategies to return our workforce if necessary, recruit teachers. Yeah, so they're talking in here about how they're having issues. They do actually admit this. To their credit, they actually admit that there was a teacher shortage in the state before this all happened, and now they're basically saying that it's really bad, and they got to try and spend some of the ARPA money to get teachers to actually want to be teachers and stay, or to address burnout, which sort of just wraps up what I just said before, or to, what's the other category of stuff they might need to do? Or to get younger people involved in teaching, which on a lot of people who actually know what they're talking about are staying away from public schools right now for very obvious reasons, because of all this money flowing through and all this obfuscation. Disengage students. So one of the things, if you actually look at the monies that they spent to try and get more social workers. What they're calling it is disengaged students. This is the group of missing students that didn't go back to school, that didn't attend virtual classes, and that quite frankly people can't find. And this is common in every state. People have just gone off the reservation. Now, some people moved when the pandemic happened, and it just wasn't properly gone through because people just wanted to leave places because they were nervous at the beginning of the pandemic, and that's understandable. But what is sort of this is morphed into is they've meshed all of those problems into this disengaged students category. This is different than homelessness and other types of students that you'll see in special groups that have to do with circumstance rather than race or sex that they talk about. But this disengaged students category is basically that we messed up, they're missing, or they have like extreme problems. They've come back. We don't know where they were for quite a while. And we kind of need to evaluate this on a case-by-case basis. They're home, but we're not sure why they weren't showing up to school regularly. And a lot of other strange combos that sort of fit into that disengaged students block that they're sort of trying to put into. But yeah, it's not good. No one's talked about that. Here, ESSER. Also, they are, and this is sort of a comment that I'm going to make. Georgetown University is woke. And clearly, that university is very pro education spending. I'm just going to leave this on the screen here for a minute with the highlight. Why is a state like New Hampshire taking funding course, basically telling their local municipalities, if you're struggling with the finances for like the way that the finances should be done on this, go to these programs at Georgetown University that are available online and evaluate them. You have the University of New Hampshire, which they reference later in this. I'm going to switch to myself because I need a moment to sort of explain this. They have a public university that is well recognized in the state of New Hampshire. It's called, it's the University of New Hampshire. It's UNH. It's the Wildcats. I don't understand. And maybe this is just because this is what counted for the federal dollars, or maybe this is just because Georgetown University was the one sponsoring it. But like, I find this to be a waste, just from a local municipality standpoint, because they've got other talent in that state that they could use to try and understand this. There really isn't. And maybe I'm missing something here. Maybe there's something about, maybe there's some Georgetown scholars who were really involved in the drafting of those sections of ARPA, who know what it's supposed to be used for, who understand what the rulings are going to go down in the different local courts. And it's like, you should do it like this to prevent issues with auditing and all this stuff. Maybe I'm overdoing this part of this video, but maybe, just maybe, before we go to a place not even close to New Hampshire and take a virtual class on how to finance on all of this, maybe we should think about we should think about what platform Georgetown's on, and what, granted, they may teach a lot of good stuff, but they have an inherent agenda, and Georgetown's made that very clear. I can't remember if people have been reporting on Georgetown, but I think they have been. There's been so many universities that have just sort of, basically, if it's a university that gets state funding and federal funding, it's basically doing stuff that it shouldn't be doing, or that is questionable. So, put my glasses back on. Need to get that out into the ether. It's just ridiculous. Like, and this is the thing too. I'm going back off for a minute. We have an entire, and I mean this quite literally, we have an entire state that is quote unquote anti-woke. That, well, or a majority of the state that's anti-woke. Republicans control the legislature. Republicans control the governor's council. Republicans control a lot of stuff. They've been doing the judicial appointments, so they've been putting originalists and textualists in. What I don't understand is, how could they have had James Lindsay, Chris Rufo, with a bunch of other people, and I'll give credit to Christian, because Christian Watson did a real good job on this, explaining what was going on, and then and I know who was in charge of follow through, and they didn't follow through, because how in the world does this stuff manage to get in here? I'm sorry, and how does it manage to get in there? And how does it manage to get to August when I'm the person reporting it and putting it out first? And tweeting at them in a DM, listen, I'm not trying to be the bearer of bad news, but I decided to just nonchalantly go through, because I had talked to Deb, and I'd been like, well, do you want me to go through the North Carolina plan? And Deb was kind of like, you can if you want to, but we know Panorama's involved. Sloan and I already know that there's plenty of proof. There's a contract going on with the state. Okay, good enough. But what New Hampshire, I was like, oh, New Hampshire must be a good example. And then you go through and you're like, holy smokes. What else is going on over there? And I know there's a lot of cognitive dissonance, but it looks as if policymakers don't even know where it's popping up, and don't know to be suspicious of, I hate to say be suspicious of everything, because that is how we've gotten to this point in questioning our own objective reality. But if you're not suspicious of public universities, I'm sorry, or public universities in the past 2 years, maybe you think everything from back to, more than 2 years ago is fine. But let's talk about now. If you think that what they're doing now is not at all political, when they basically declared that they're going to be political entities in their own little spheres, I'm sorry. I don't know what universe you're living in, because this isn't pretty. All right, let's go back into it. I'm probably going to be shutting this down soon. SCA response. It's badly, like I said, like I would love to see what's actually in the 603 Bright Future survey and what else is going on. But they spent a lot of money on stuff that they shouldn't have. This bilingual educator, this is just what they're identifying are the issues that for education. This is something else that we need to talk about. This teacher shortages, they admit it in this section. In some states, like in Oregon, they're getting, because the teacher shortage is so bad, they're getting rid of the requirements. For example, like Oregon school teachers don't need to know how to do math. That is a real thing. That is really going on with the temporary licenses that are going on over in Oregon, the temporary allowances for those teachers to work. But in New Hampshire, system's a little bit different than Massachusetts. I don't know what they mean by alternate credential pathways. It could be that these people have credentials in Vermont or have had past credentials in Vermont and have had past credentials in Maine. And although I feel like those would translate easy, but again, not that's sort of where my experience sort of flatlines and sort of more of a gray area. But I'm kind of concerned if New Hampshire's doing something even close to what Oregon's doing. And it's very likely because there's minimal information given here, just like with everything in this document, man. This isn't like what happened in Arizona where it was on display. It was a full conversation before they actually admit that they're going to go into a contract with Panorama, that they're debating between Castle and Panorama for a contract on social emotional learning. And then they're like, we're going to totally go with Panorama after we do this preliminary step with Castle. It's just, this is a lot more covert, but you got to look for this stuff. And then you got to ask questions. This is one of the more vague, but also we have real world examples about where this is popping out of. Again, alternate learning credentials, alternate credential pathways. And what does diverse workforce mean to the state of New Hampshire? Because they don't have a lot of things centralized, it's actually a really hard answer to get compared to Arizona, but I have a bad feeling. Because if they're working with Panorama, we already know that they're not really crossing their T's and dotting their I's really when I'm looking at it. And at the end of this document is just even more stuff to even more documents for things that I've sort of zoomed, kind of bloomed through and what have you. Oh gosh, I've almost been on here for an hour. I've never done an hour of content on this channel before. So that's sort of it. There is not a single, although there is another Republican candidate that just got nominated, but that means that there's going to have to be a primary election anyway for the governor's seat if that person actually puts in their paperwork properly. But out of all the candidates that are definitely going to run in the race for governor, there ain't a single one that knows what they're talking about. There ain't a single one that's been nominated by a political party that's followed through on anything. And we can count the current governor, who is easily going to be the current nominee of the Republican Party, to be one of those people. There ain't a single one that has paid attention to the funding flow of this and how this is going to affect public schools for quite a while. When I was these funds have to be used within several fiscal cycles. Municipal governments like cities and towns get to use these funds a little bit longer, up until fiscal year, I believe 26 or 27. I'd have to double check the language on that. But they have to use this stuff, in fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24, and now. They can't not use it. And actually, I think they have to use it all within fiscal year 23, if I'm correct. So it's not good. I don't know why. I don't know why no one's asking the Commissioner of Education what's going on up there, and I have no idea what's happening in the state legislature. But clearly, they didn't pick up any information from the situation with HB 544. But I'm going to kind of end it there. I don't want to go too much over. So that is the show about what's going on in New Hampshire with, I hope you learned and understood, and as I kind of went through this document, what was going on. I really appreciate you guys watching the video. I really appreciate everybody. If you want to like and subscribe, I have a locals. I have, if you want to go to that, I post free content on there. I post anytime that I sort of want to. And thank you. This has been Live at 9 with myself, Justice Graves, on my channel. We've been talking about what's going on in New Hampshire with the ARPA funds. And I hope you have a great rest of your day whenever you're watching this. Take care and see you soon. Bye.